The journey of Doll of Marble and the man took them across the lands of Anor, through the sprawling nations and across the borders of faith that divided the world. Temple by temple they went, speaking not with swords or sorcery, but with words that pierced through centuries of belief like arrows through smoke. Their encounters with gods, both the benevolent and the malevolent, had left them scarred but enlightened. They knew the truth now that gods were not infallible, nor were they necessary for the world to thrive. They used this truth, weaving it into their speeches, to unravel the faith that kept the masses shackled to their divine overseers. Doll of Marble, unchanging and eternal, stood before crowds in grand temples of light and dark alike. Her marble form, once a statue of forgotten reverence, now became a symbol of defiance against the heavens. She told stories of the Fey Mother, Lanolin, who wept for her lost love and gifted them tools to bring about the undoing of all who are shackled to the gods. She spoke of Isennis, the Drow Father, whose power was born from the seed of doubt planted by his creators, and how even the gods themselves were not free from perfection. But it was not just her words. Doll of Marble's very existence, her immortality and her curse, embodied the contradictions of the divine. She could not die, no matter how much she wished for release, yet she stood before them not as a figure of despair, but as one who had reclaimed her agency. She used her endless life to prove that even immortality, a gift many sought, could be a curse when tied to the whims of gods. Her presence shook the faith of many who saw her a living testament that gods could not bring happiness or fulfillment, only chains. The man, however, was the voice that ignited the fire. He spoke with the passion of one who had been betrayed, his words laced with the fury of someone who had once believed, only to have his faith twisted and broken. He told the people about the gods' control, their manipulation of mortal lives for their own ends. He shared his dream, the dream that had once driven him to revere the gods, a dream that had been shattered when he saw those he loved puppeteered by them. His words were sharp, cutting through the devout with surgical precision. He offered them freedom, freedom from the gods' grasp, freedom to shape their own destinies. Together, Doll of Marble and the man were an unstoppable force. Kingdoms that once worshipped the divine began to crumble under the weight of their words. Entire congregations turned their backs on the temples, leaving the once grand altars empty and the priests in despair. The gods themselves grew restless. Where once they had been unquestioned, now whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire among their followers. Even the most devout began to question their place in the grand design of the gods, doubt taking root where once there had been only blind faith. But as their crusades spread, so too did the rift between Doll of Marble and the man. At first it was subtle. Doll of Marble remained steady, her gaze always fixed on the larger purpose. She sought to free mortals from the suffering inflicted by the gods, to show them that they could stand on their own without divine intervention. Her immortality gave her a patient, measured approach, one that sought understanding and balance. The man, however, grew more intense with each passing day. The further they traveled, the more temples they dismantled, the more his hatred festered. What had started as a desire for freedom and truth twisted into something darker. He no longer cared simply to free people from the gods. He wanted to tear down every last shred of their influence. His speeches became more furious, more violent in tone, urging not just abandonment of faith, but the destruction of temples, the burning of holy texts. He began to see the gods not just as flawed beings, but as enemies that needed to be obliterated. Doll of Marble began to notice the change in him. She watched as his speeches became angrier, as his once thoughtful debates turned into fiery demands for action. He would not simply deconvert the faithful, he would incite them to destroy the very symbols of belief. Where she sought understanding and reason, he sought to stoke the fires of revolution. One evening, after they had spoken at a particularly influential temple in the nation of Eberlen, the tension finally reached a breaking point. They stood in the temple courtyard, the marble columns casting long shadows under the setting sun. The air was thick with the tension of their latest confrontation, and Doll of Marble could feel the rift growing between them like a chasm, wide and unbridgeable. "You go too far," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It was never our goal to destroy everything." The man turned to her, his eyes blazing with the intensity that had come to define him. "You do not understand," he spat, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "These people will never be free as long as the god's influence remains. We can't just take their faith away, we have to burn it to the ground. Every symbol, every temple, every relic. Only then will they be free." Doll of Marble shook her head slowly. "Freedom isn't found in destruction. You can't build a future on the ashes of everything people once believed in. They need time to understand, to let go. You cannot force them to change overnight." "Time, ? The man scoffed, his fists clenched at his sides. "I do not have time. You," he pointed at her, his voice rising, "you have eternity. You can wait forever for them to come around. But I do not have that luxury. Every day we waste, more people suffer under the god's lies." Doll of Marble's expression softened, but her words were resolute. "This isn't about you. It's about them. If we force them too hard, we will become just like the gods we are fighting against." The man's face twisted in fury. "No," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We will be nothing like them. They enslave. We free." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sun sank lower on the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the temple ruins behind them. Doll of Marble could feel the weight of the man's rage pressing against her like a storm, but she stood firm, unmoving in the face of his growing fanaticism. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are becoming what you hate." The man's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Doll of Marble saw something in him that frightened her, a darkness that went beyond anger. A shadow of something else, something deeper, rooted in pain and betrayal. "I will do whatever it takes," he said quietly, "to make sure no one ever suffers at the hands of a god again." And with that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the empty temple courtyard, leaving Doll of Marble standing alone in the fading light, the rift between them now undeniable, and perhaps irreparable. Doll of Marble continued her journey alone, moving from one nation to the next, speaking to the people in quiet tones and guiding them toward the truth. She traveled through the lands of Anor, not as a conqueror, but as a quiet revolution, her words the only weapon she needed. She spoke to kings in their courts and farmers in their fields, to priests and scholars alike. Her message remained the same: the gods were not the answer to mortal suffering, and true freedom lay in understanding and reason, not in divine favor or wrath. Though she was alone, Doll of Marble never felt truly isolated. Her immortality had long dulled the pain of solitude, and now she found solace in the change she inspired. Where the man had once incited rage, she encouraged contemplation. She became a figure of quiet rebellion, moving in the shadows, helping people to see the gods for what they truly were: flawed, distant, and unnecessary. Temples still stood where she passed, but the belief inside them waned, the once fervent prayers now whispered half-heartedly. Faith still existed, but it was weakening, unraveling like thread from an old tapestry. Yet, as Doll of Marble sowed understanding, the man, the one who had once walked by her side, was forging a very different path. His name became a whisper on the wind, then a roar as he gathered followers, not through quiet persuasion, but through fury and promise. His message was stark: the gods must be purged from the world, their temples razed, their influence torn from the hearts of men. He no longer sought mere freedom from divine rule. He sought the complete annihilation of the gods and their worship. With each temple he destroyed, his army grew. They called themselves the Purifiers, men and women who had once been believers, but who now followed the man's vision of a world cleansed of all faith. His army moved across the land like wildfire, torching shrines and executing those who refused to abandon their gods. His speeches, once rooted in the pain of betrayal, now echoed with the rhetoric of a crusader. He spoke not just of freedom, but of a new world order, one where humanity stood united under the banner of secularism, free from the chains of divine interference. But it was not freedom that drove him now. It was control. Word of his movement reached Doll of Marble as she traveled through the kingdom of Irianth, a place once known for its devout worship of the Fey Mother. She had spent weeks there, quietly working to guide the people away from the blind devotion that had ruled their lives for centuries. Her methods were slow, deliberate, and patient. She spoke in public forums, engaged in long conversations, and encouraged the people to question the very nature of faith. And they listened. The temples still stood, but fewer people visited them. Priests found themselves with dwindling congregations, and the king himself began to question the necessity of worship in the affairs of state. But it was then, in the midst of her quiet revolution, that Doll of Marble heard the terrible news. The man was coming. His army was close, and with it came fire, destruction, and death to those who clung to the gods. His purifiers were zealous, filled with hatred for the divine, and they would stop at nothing until every temple was destroyed and every believer either converted or killed. Doll of Marble felt a heaviness settle over her, a weight of inevitability she had hoped to avoid. She had known this moment might come, but she had hoped that their paths would never cross again. Yet now it seemed fate had other plans. When the man's army finally reached Irianth, Doll of Marble stood alone on the battlefield, waiting for him. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, where the man's forces gathered like a storm. Thousands of purifiers stood behind him, a sea of determined faces, their eyes filled with the fire of zealotry. They bore banners of black and silver, symbols of their movement, and at their head stood the man she had once known as an ally. He had changed. His face was harder, his eyes darker, and the kindness that had once been there was now replaced by something colder, more relentless. He wore armor that gleamed in the dying light, and his sword was drawn, resting at his side like a promise of violence. Doll of Marble stood unarmed as she always did. Her marble skin glowed faintly in the fading light, her eyes as calm and unyielding as ever. She felt no fear, only a deep sadness at what had become of the man she had once admired. He approached her, his army standing still behind him, waiting for his command. For a moment, there was only silence between them, a silence filled with the weight of everything that had passed since they had last stood together. "You came alone," the man said at last, his voice cold and distant. Doll of Marble nodded. "I did. I always have." The man's eyes flickered with something dash anger, perhaps, or pity. "You should have joined me," he said, his voice low. "Together, we could have changed everything." "We did change everything," Doll of Marble replied softly. "But not in the way you think." The man's jaw tightened. "Look at them," he said, gesturing to his army. "They believe in me now. They believe in the world I am building, a world without gods. This is the future. Why can't you see that?" Doll of Marble shook her head slowly. "This isn't the future. This is just another form of control. You have become the very thing you despise, the thing you claim to want to destroy." "I am nothing like them," the man snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "I am freeing these people from the gods, from the lies they have been told their whole lives." "You are forcing them," Doll of Marble replied calmly. "Just like the gods. You are not giving them a choice. You are taking it away." The man's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "I am giving them a world where they do not have to bow to anyone." "But they are still bowing to you," Doll of Marble said quietly. For a moment, the man said nothing. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to find some trace of the ally she had once been, but all he saw was the calm resolve in her gaze. She was unbreakable, like the marble of her form, and he knew then that she would never bend to him. just as she would never bend to the gods. "This world doesn't need gods," the man said at last, his voice filled with cold finality. "And it does not need you." Doll of Marble looked at him, her eyes unable to cry yet still filled with sorrow. "It needs understanding," she said. "Not war, not destruction, not death." The man's eyes hardened. "There's no point in talking anymore." Doll of Marble met his gaze in silence. And with that, the man turned and raised his sword, his army shifting behind him, ready to strike. "You have made your choice, and I have made mine." Doll of Marble stood alone on the battlefield, her eyes fixed on the man who had once been her friend, now her enemy, as the storm of war began to crash down around her.